time goes by, an eye for an eye. We in this together, son, your beef is mine. So long as the sun...
Mighty easy to make a living with cotton. And you had the benefit of human labor there that was about as inexpensive as you could get. And these big plantations, they would have thousands of blacks that worked there. I mean, you couldn't raise it without the blacks. But without human labor there, you couldn't exist. Not only important, it was vital.
The plantation system offered African Americans work, but very little else. It was a system ripe for abuse.
It was known on some plantations that the only thing that the people gathered in life was what you would call 3 M's, meat, meal, and molasses. And they would work from sun up until sundown. And when the season was over, the only thing they had left was an indebtment of $400 or $500, something they couldn't afford. Because the white owners say during the time that they worked for that season, they had used up all the meat, meal, and molasses. But they had nothing. And when I say nothing, I mean nothing.
The planters looked at black people as workers. They looked at black people as people who should be willing and eager to work for them to produce their cotton. And when they weren't eager, they could be coerced.
Well, I won't call his name, but there was a plantation owner that carried a bull up all the time. And he spoke with that book. And I've seen him beat the blacks on Washington Avenue because they didn't get out of his way.
Straight for Greenville. The massive flood is about to expose long-standing divides between blacks and whites. Here, the cotton industry drives the economy. Many of the cotton farmers are poor sharecroppers. Sharecropping, a system of tenant farming that developed after the Civil War, is widely practiced. Ex-slaves and their descendants work the land belonging to plantation owners. They give a share of their crop earnings back to the landlords. These landlords, known as planters, hold an unfair advantage.
The relationship was a power relationship where the landlord had all the power, and the sharecropper was at the beck and call of the planter.
It became a very exploitative system. Oftentimes, plantation owners would also own stores where African Americans would purchase supplies they may need after the crops were sold. Instead of having a profit, the sharecropper would oftentimes emerge deeply in debt.
Black sharecroppers are also subject to Jim Crow laws, which govern race relations throughout the South. 87-year-old Juanita Turney grew up in Greenville under her grandmother's watchful eye. She recalls the racial discrimination she encountered as a child.
I did not try to drink water from a fountain that said color. I drank my water before I left home. We couldn't go to the library. We couldn't go to their schools. There were a number of things that we could not do.
Now, in fighting the raging Mississippi, wealthy white planters exploit their relationship with black sharecroppers and treat them as if they were still slaves.
Every plantation owner would simply gather up his sharecroppers in trucks and drive them to the levee.
And they were part of the economic capital that many planters felt that they owned and had the right to manipulate and to dispense at their will.
The planters order the sharecroppers to work without pay, filling sandbags and hauling them to the crown of the levee. As the threat of flood increases, the planters' abusive methods ensure the blacks' cooperation.
In some areas, you actually had Boy Scouts holding guns on African American men, forcing them to stay on the levee and work.
April 15th, 1927. A storm front from the Gulf of Mexico produces torrential rain. From St. Louis all the way to the Gulf, the downpour pummels an already saturated Mississippi Valley. The storm dumps between 6 and 10 inches of rain. The storm lasts 6 days.
Everybody in town was tense, and they were finding faults with the levee, and nobody knew where it was going to break or if it was going to break. They were just praying that the rain would stop and things would get better, but it didn't.
The amount of rain was too much for the levee system to handle. April 21st. It's at this point that a chunk of the levee at Mound Landing collapses, 18 miles north of Greenville, killing hundreds. It's only a matter of time before the massive wave of floodwater reaches Greenville.
The rains began. It lasted for 8 months. The river rose to record heights.
The levees trembled when you walked on them. The workers knew it was hopeless, but there was nothing else to do but fight. Will Percy.
The water was near the top of the levees for a long period of time, so everyone was in a state of quite...
Guard the levee against Mississippi people. Mississippi people guard the levee against the Arkansas people. Afraid somebody will blow the levee and turn the water loose on the other side. If I blow your side of the levee, you're going to get washed off the face of the earth, and I'm going to stay dry. Because the water didn't come my way. It went your way.
The wall of water kept pushing south. Levees began to collapse along the Arkansas River. It was already the worst flood on record, and it was aiming all its force at Greenville. In desperation, Percy and his fellow planters pulled their workers from the fields to do battle with the river. They became part of an army of 30,000 men, including convicts, who struggled to raise the height of the levees with rows of sandbags. Still, the river continued to rise. When even more men were needed on the levees, Greenville's police resorted to force.
They started going through Greenville and taking all of the black men. This is another thing that I can remember so plainly. All of the black people, even kids out of school, to go and protect the levee. And almost man for man, or boy for boy, the whites had guns on, and the others had nothing but picks and shovels.
They had shotguns. They just herded them up and threw them to the levee. Right down Nelson Street, that was the Negro drag at the time, and they just got them off the streets and just carried them right down to the levee and taught them to work.
White residents began to panic. Those who could afford it boarded trains leaving the region. Upriver from Greenville, at a great bend in the river, the Mound Landing levee was showing signs of trouble. On Good Friday, the Delta was battered by the most savage storm of them all. As much as 15 inches of rain fell in 18 hours. One resident recorded in his diary, "Heaven spare us." The Mound's Landing levee was beginning to crumble.
Cold, damp, rainy. The break is increasing. The water's washing over top of the levee. And according to some accounts, the levee starts feeling loose.
The water started rising an inch an hour. That's fast. That's 2 feet a day. There is a limit to how high you can build sandbags.
They didn't think it gonna hold. In fact, it was getting worse by the minute. They were throwing all the sandbags in there they could, and but this kept getting bigger and bigger, and they couldn't stop it.
Men working on the sandbags know full well there's no way that this thing is going to hold. and they start to abandon the position. And the National Guard officer orders rifles held on them and threatens to shoot them if they leave.
And these fellows were filling their sacks with sand. And my stepfather, he noticed that at the bottom of the levee, some water started coming out. And he grabbed my arm, I guess. And he said, run, Johnny boy. Run for your life.
And the levee starts shaking, rumble, and men start running, and all of a sudden, a big section of the levee, several hundred feet wide, just sort of pushes out and carries men with it.
Screaming, yelling, blood-curdling, yelling. And they were gone. You let the Mississippi out, and you could almost hear it yelling. It's free. Free again. And man, it came out with a roar. Oof. My stepfather said to me, he said, God damn. He said, remember, Johnny boy, you have a lot of close calls in your life. You're not going to have any close ones tonight.
The break at Mound's Landing released more than double the volume of Niagara Falls. It flooded an area 50 miles wide and 100 miles long. It put water over the tops of houses in Yazoo City, 75 miles away. The deluge was cascading south through the cotton fields of Washington County. It was only a matter of hours before the water reached Greenville, inundating the city from the rear.
The greatest flood in American history was upon us. We did not see our lands again for 4 months. Will Percy, 1927.
A rolling giant sea covered 26,000 square miles of the Mississippi Valley, inundating parts of 7 states and forcing 500,000 people from their homes. The system of levees designed to hold back the river had failed.
154 Red Cross relief camps set up throughout the region. These camps house more than 500,000 black farm laborers and their families, and less than 55,000 whites. Within the confines of the camps, segregation and exploitation are common. Red Cross relief is done within the context of Jim Crow laws, which govern race relations in the South.
The camps reflected and reproduced the racial realities of the time period in the different treatment of black and white refugees. And it really became a place where local plantation owners would oftentimes have a say in how the camps were run.
We're talking about 1927 in the era of segregation and discrimination. So when the relief started, first of all, the whites got the tents and the cots and the better food and the better clothing.
In the black relief camps, people got very meager portions of food, and the types of food they got was very low in terms of the nutritional scale.
While displaced whites receive meat and canned fruits, blacks get rations of bread and molasses. Making the camp conditions worse is another change in the weather. The heavy rains and unseasonably cold temperatures subside, only to be replaced with sweltering heat. Temperatures soar. These high temperatures speed up the decomposition of dead fish floating in the floodwaters. The stench is unbearable. Those who are stranded can't escape the weather and can't leave the camps either. National Guardsmen, brought in to help preserve order, keep the blacks confined to the camps. Such is not the case in the white camps.
In the white camps, they provided kind of an advisory and supervisory kind of role, but in the African-American camps, they were armed, and they oftentimes prevented blacks from leaving and entering the camps on a free basis.
The guardsmen do not allow displaced blacks to leave the camps without the permission of a planter.
They were very much sort of helping to provide the enforcement mechanism that would keep African Americans in their places. If you stepped out of place, you would have to pay, and you would have to pay oftentimes by a confrontation with the National Guardsmen.
The reason they were kept in the camps was so that the planters would have access to them when the water went down. And only the planters could get them out.
The planters also exploit the sharecroppers through the distribution of Red Cross relief supplies.
The people who are in charge of the running of the camp and the distribution of those supplies, those would oftentimes be local planters, local plantation owners, who would oftentimes use those provisions in order to exercise control over sharecroppers and tenant farmers who were in the camps.
Accusations of corruption circulate when white planters begin to stockpile Red Cross aid and then sell the goods to black sharecroppers on credit.
They learned that they could manipulate federal relief to their own advantage. The planters would take the food and distribute it to their help, but they'd put it on their bill.
The planters' methods generate income for themselves while keeping sharecroppers in debt.
Let the world know. As time goes by, an eye for an eye. We in this together, son. Your beef is mine. So long as the sunshine can light up the sky.